For years, we have been told the same story over and over again. China is rising. China wants global dominance. China wants to replace the United States as the ruler of the world. You hear this narrative everywhere. In Western media, political speeches, documentaries, even Hollywood movies. The assumption is simple. If China becomes powerful enough, it will eventually do exactly what America did after World War II. Building alliances everywhere, dominate global politics, police the world, and reshape other countries in its own image. But what if that assumption is completely wrong? What if China's real strategy is actually the opposite? Because when you start looking at how Chinese leaders think, what Chinese state media teaches its population, and how China behaves internationally, a very different picture starts to emerge. And honestly, this changes the entire conversation about China's rise. China may want to become extremely powerful. China may want to become extremely rich. China may want to become impossible to bully. But becoming the world's sole superpower? That may not actually be the goal at all. One of the most fascinating things China ever produced was a massive documentary series aired on Chinese state television called The Rise and Fall of Nations. This wasn't just some random history documentary. This was essentially political education for the entire country. The Chinese government replayed the series over and over again across China because they wanted the people, especially the officials, to understand one thing: how great powers succeed and how great powers collapse. Now, here's the really interesting part. Out of all the countries discussed in the documentary, only two nations were given two full episodes: the United States and the Soviet Union. That alone tells you everything. Because in the eyes of Beijing, these are the two most important examples of modern superpowers' success and failure. According to the documentary, America became the world's dominant power because it focused first on becoming economically unstoppable. Before America became the global military giant we know today, it spent decades building industry, infrastructure, technology, factories, universities, and wealth. In other words, America became rich first. Only after becoming overwhelmingly wealthy did the US begin taking on the role of global leader after World War II. But the Soviet Union did the opposite. The USSR tried to compete militarily with the US before its economy was truly ready. It spent enormous amounts of money trying to maintain military parity while its people faced economic stagnation at home. Eventually, the imbalance became too much, and the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, think about this from China's perspective. Chinese leaders watched the Soviet collapse very carefully. In fact, many analysts believe it deeply shaped modern Chinese strategy, and Beijing came to a simple conclusion: never sacrifice economic development for geopolitical ambition. That's why China today still prioritizes manufacturing, technology, infrastructure, education, and domestic growth above everything else. Even now, Chinese officials constantly repeat that China is still a developing country. A lot of people in the West laugh at this statement because China is already very powerful. It has giant cities, advanced high-speed rail, tech companies, and the world's second largest economy. But China looks at things very differently. China focuses heavily on per capita wealth. And when you look at the numbers, China's GDP per person is still far below than the United States. America's average wealth per person is still several times higher than China. So from Beijing's perspective, China is not at the global management stage yet. They still believe they are in the national development stage. That's a huge difference. And honestly, it explains a lot of China's behavior today. Now, this is where things get even more interesting. Because beyond economics, there's also a completely different worldview involved here. For the last 200 years, the world has mainly been dominated by two superpowers. First, the British Empire, then the United States, and both countries shared something very important in common. They believed their values were universal. The British believed they had a civilizing mission. The Americans believed democracy and human rights are universal values that should spread across the world. Whether you agree or disagree with these ideas is not the point. The point is this worldview naturally creates intervention. Because if you truly believe your system is universally correct, then eventually you feel justified trying to spread it. That's why America often becomes heavily involved overseas, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The underlying idea was often we can help transform these countries. Now, compare that mindset to China. China does not really operate from a universal ideological worldview, right? China's thinking is far more civilizational and national. Their primary focus is not how do we transform the world. Their focus is how do we make China strong again. That's a massive difference. Chinese leaders are not trying to create a world where every country becomes politically similar to China. In fact, many Chinese policymakers probably think that's impossible anyway because they see China as unique to Chinese history, culture, and civilization. This is why China rarely talks about exporting its political model. You almost never hear Chinese officials saying the world should become more like China. Instead, what they usually say is countries should choose their own path. Now, of course, critics argue China still expands its influence economically and strategically through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's true. China absolutely wants influence. Every major power wants influence. But influence is not the same thing as wanting to directly rule the world. And this distinction matters because when China invests in Africa, Southeast Asia, or the Middle East, Beijing usually does not demand that those countries become politically Chinese. China mostly cares about stability, trade access, resources, and strategic partnerships. That's why many developing countries actually prefer dealing with China sometimes, because China generally avoids lecturing other governments about how they should run their countries, right? Again, whether that's morally good or bad is a separate debate, but it is very different from the Western model. And understanding that difference is critical if you want to understand China's rise. Now, here's the part that really surprises many people. China may actually benefit from America continuing to carry the burden of global leadership. Think about it. Maintaining global empire is expensive, very expensive. The US maintains hundreds of military bases worldwide. It patrols global shipping lanes. It protects allies across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It spends massive amounts of money maintaining global military dominance. And all of these cost trillions of dollars over time. China looks at this situation and probably sees both strengths and weaknesses. Yes, America's global presence gives Washington enormous influence, but it also drains resources. Wars become expensive. Foreign conflicts become political headaches. Global policing creates endless responsibilities. And Beijing has watched this happen for decades. They watched America spend years in Iraq and Afghanistan. They watched the financial costs rise. They watched domestic divisions inside US grow. Meanwhile, China focused heavily on something else: economic growth, factories, infrastructure, ports, supply chains, technology, manufacturing, trade. While America was fighting costly wars overseas, China was becoming the manufacturing center of the world. That's not an accident, that's strategy. In many ways, China appears perfectly happy letting the US continue carrying the enormous burden of managing global security, while China concentrates on strengthening itself internally. And honestly, from Beijing's perspective, that may actually be the smarter long-term approach, because history shows that maintaining global dominance often exhausts great powers. The British Empire became overstretched. The Soviet Union became overstretched. China desperately wants to avoid making the same mistake. This is why Chinese leaders constantly emphasize phrases like peaceful development and win-win cooperation. Now, of course, many countries remain suspicious of China's intentions, especially regarding Taiwan, the South China Sea, and regional influence, and those concerns are real. But even there, China's priorities often appear regional rather than global. Beijing seems far more focused on securing its immediate surroundings and protecting what it sees as core national interests than trying to directly govern distant parts of the world. That's a very different ambition from building a worldwide ideological empire. At the end of the day, China's grand strategy may not be about ruling the world. It may simply be about making sure nobody can rule China ever again. And when you understand China's history, the century of humiliation, foreign invasions, civil war, and poverty, that mindset suddenly makes a lot more sense. China's leaders seem obsessed with one thing above all else: national strength, economic power, technological independence, political stability, military deterrence, not necessarily becoming the global police force. And ironically, this may be the biggest misunderstanding happening between China and the West right now. Because America often assumes rising powers naturally wants global dominance, but China may be pursuing something very different. Not a Chinese world order, but a world where China is finally too powerful to ever be pushed around again. What do you think about this? Is China really avoiding the global dominance, or is it just playing a longer and quieter game? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting content like this. Thank you for watching.